Hi, welcome to my channel, Mask of Science. I'm producing a series of short videos for an important purpose. To show you point by point why evolution's false. And today my subject is the origin of aesthetic design in nature. So I'll begin with a question: how does the theory of evolution explain beauty? Actually, it doesn't. It can't. This is an obstacle that's rarely considered by evolutionary biologists. It's a challenge that's often casually dismissed because many think that the evaluation of aesthetic design isn't scientific. However, Darwin recognized that beauty posed a big challenge to his theory. In fact, in Origin of Species, he stated that if it could be shown that beauty existed only for the sake of beauty, it would be absolutely fatal to evolutionary theory. In fact, later in life, Darwin once remarked that the very sight of a peacock's tail made him feel sick. This is because the theory of evolution is built on the assumption that the origin of every complexity of nature can be explained because of utilitarian value to enhance reproduction. For example, the elaborate adornment of flowers has been ascribed to attracting insects so that the flower's pollen will be disseminated, thus enhancing reproduction of the plant. Now, just because you can ascribe a function to something doesn't mean that evolution could create it, especially in the case of beauty. Because in every case, whatever function that you can imagine could have been met by a much less elaborate design. You can't just say that a peacock developed a colorful tail to attract a mate. It's more than just colorful, it's complex. Why, for example, are all the eyes and the feathers of a peacock's tail staggered in their positions in individual feathers, such that when the peacock displays its tail, the eyes are proportionally spaced? If you examine the feathers of the great argus of Indonesia, look at the round spots. There's an illusion of 3D. On close inspection, notice how there are abrupt, off-centered pale highlights. These are crescent-shaped, so they look like they're refracting light from a curved surface. And look at the dark countershading along the edges of the round spots. Notice how the color fades towards the center and gets progressively darker towards the edges. This creates the illusion of 3D. This is an extremely complex design, and this cannot be attributed to the simplistic idea of sexual selection through mutations. When you examine this feather, I suggest that you consider what it would take for random mistakes in DNA replication to result in something like this. Most people couldn't even paint such a design utilizing their best efforts. There are many examples in life forms that show deliberate artistic design, and you can look at nature and logically infer intelligent design. And to look at this more objectively, I'd like to point out a few principles of art appreciation that are universally accepted. First, a work of art should show technical skills. Second, a work of art invokes pleasure for beauty's sake, not because it provides practical utility such as food or shelter. And third, a work of art shows unity, balance, and proportion. I'm going over these points so that you can look at nature and see these elements of deliberate artistic design, and these cannot be ascribed to evolutionary mechanisms. A striking example of aesthetic design in nature are the elaborate color patterns of many coral reef fishes. Notice the delicate stripes that outline the fins and tails and tasteful color coordination. Why is this tail outlined in an offset color pattern? And why are the edges of the fins highlighted with delicate contrasting lines of color? What is the functional purpose of these three parallel bands of color at the edge of the tail? Now, I hope you don't just casually look at this and say, okay, fine, I agree, they're beautiful. You need to consider Darwinian mechanisms. How did random mutations create these patterns, and what is the utilitarian value of this coloration that caused these changes to be preserved by natural selection? If you listen to the talking points of evolution, you'll hear the claim that evolution is the best theory that can explain what we see, and that deliberate design makes no sense. Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Darwin, was stunned when he first saw these fish on his visit to Indonesia. So why are these fish regarded by everyone, including evolutionary biologists, as objects of beauty, as works of art? Because they appear intelligently designed. As I mentioned before, one of the characteristics of aesthetic design and art is that it goes beyond functionality. When an architect creates ornamented columns with flutes and scrolls, he's going beyond just supporting a building. And by the same token, the lavish adornment of these reef fishes goes far beyond any imaginary function that has been ascribed by evolutionary biologists. This is a hallmark of intelligent design. A curious observation in hundreds of species of reef fishes is the presence of parallel bands of color which occur in the skin and then continue in the eye so as to transect the pupil in the center. This presents an enormous barrier to evolution because the genes that control skin color are different than the genes that prescribe eye color. Another observation is the existence of bilateral symmetry in these color patterns. If you look at the copper-banded butterfly fish, notice that the stripes on one side of the body are mirror images of the stripes on the opposite side. This seems to indicate that those stripes are prescribed by one set of genetic instructions, with the patterns meeting in the midline. Why then is the composite midline stripe also identical to the stripes on the side of the fish? This would require an increased complexity of a genetic code. So the question needs to be asked, what is the survival advantage of having a composite central midline stripe that perfectly coordinates with the other stripes? The issues I'm raising are not addressed in the literature. Many biologists believe that beauty is only in the eye of the beholder, and therefore you don't have to logically explain its existence. But even if you ascribe to the belief that there is no such thing as beauty in any absolute terms, it cannot be denied that coral reef fishes display ordered patterns of color in their skin. If the patterns are ordered, then they need to be explained in terms of how and why they came into existence, through random mutations. In most of the articles I've read, all that's acknowledged is that these reef fishes are brightly colored. There is no discussion as to how and why these ordered patterns of color originated. Of course, specific challenges like this are never discussed in terms of evolution because it's utterly ridiculous to try to explain them by the crude mechanism of mutations and natural selection. There are two fundamental problems with trying to explain the coloration of coral reef fish. First, every complexity had to be preserved by natural selection because of utilitarian value. Not just the end result, but every iteration of change leading up to the finished pattern. This had to occur in incremental steps. This means that if a mutation occurred that resulted in a color that was slightly more ordered than the previous, it needed to be functionally superior to its predecessor. And second, even if you can figure out a survival benefit for each incremental step, you need to explain how random mutations created the ordered patterns. Let's look at the first problem, the functionality of these patterns. Evolutionary biologists have postulated that these patterns came into existence to attract a mate, or for camouflage, or to confuse predators, or to stand out from other species in the crowded coral reef environment. None of these suggestions are plausible, and certainly none would require the degree of perfection that exists. As far as attracting a mate, there's no difference from one fish to the next in terms of patterns. Both males and females are equally ornamented. Furthermore, many of these fish spawn in schools, so there's no actual pairing of individual males and females. As far as camouflage, many of these creatures appear to stand out from the environment like fishing lures, which would only serve to attract prey. As far as confusing predators, this is also implausible. The major predators are sharks and moray eels, and they feed almost exclusively at night, have poor vision, and rely heavily on their sense of smell to locate prey. Now let's consider the how. Even if a function can be imagined, how did the patterns originate? How could random mutations create these patterns? If you look at crossbars in the eyes, what are the odds of a mutation occurring in a different gene that coincidentally matches the patterns in the skin? And why are the stripes in the skin lined up so that the pattern will be repeated in the eye so that it perfectly transects the pupil? I'll refer you to my other video on mathematics. There is no possibility that random mutations occurring in a lineage of fish will repeatedly show predilection for the same genes. It's possible for a person to win the lottery once. It's not possible for one person to win the lottery 50 times in a year. Now, after you look at coral reef fish, Consider what can be created through selective breeding. This is a koi. It's a colorful carp that has been selectively bred as an ornamental fish. And we all see what random mutations can do. After over 200 years of skillful breeding, all that can be achieved are more examples of random coloration. So to those of you who might believe in evolution, I'll pose this question. Do you think that if random mating of kois continues for millions of years into the future, that the patterns will start becoming ordered? If you think that evolution can account for every complexity in nature, then you're believing in a process that doesn't exist, that random mutations can result in ordered patterns. You believe in something that flies in the face of all human observation, that order can spontaneously arise from chaos. If you believe in the mechanisms of evolution, you have to believe that all of these complex patterns appeared exclusively by chance and were preserved solely for utilitarian value to enhance reproductive success. Many who promote evolution have embedded in their talking points the claim that the laws of physics and other laws of science can explain everything we see. It's often stated that those who reject evolution are scientifically ignorant and just don't understand the explanatory power of evolution. So according to the dogmas of evolution, you cannot look at one of these beautiful creatures and logically infer that it was intelligently designed. Evolution is claimed to be able to account for every observation of the living world. But despite the claim that Darwin erased the need for God, this challenge I'm making is unanswered in the literature that I've read. In fact, it's not even addressed. Now, if you bring up this challenge to someone who's committed to evolution, you're likely to be countered with one or more of the following excuses. First, beauty is downplayed as unimportant and subjective and can't be evaluated scientifically. Understand that evolution is founded on a relativistic worldview that denies absolute standards, including probability. But even if you ascribe to the belief that the evaluation of beauty is subjective, the fact that patterns of design in marine fish are ordered is not subjective. When this issue is addressed, reef fish are only described as brightly colored. In this way, there is a denial that there is any order to these patterns. And as with all arguments for evolution, rebuttals are often laced with philosophical opinions regarding the presumed nature of an intelligent designer. It's sometimes stated, why didn't God create all animals beautiful? This is merely a Marxist worldview. It's up to the evolutionist to explain how and why any beauty exists, rather than to philosophize why God didn't create all life equally beautiful. And finally, it's argued that there would be no purpose in the creation of beauty in obscured life forms that are almost never observed, such as species in the deep ocean. This is not a scientific argument. It presupposes the purpose of an intelligent creator. You can't prove evolution by attempting to disprove God. Now, I've only scratched the surface in this presentation. There are many additional examples of aesthetic design in nature, in birds, insects, mollusks, plants, mammals, amphibians, and other living things. I focused on color patterns. Artistic elements of form are also seen, particularly in seashells. And when you evaluate these features and consider their complexity, two things are obvious. They couldn't have been created by evolutionary mechanisms. On the contrary, they loudly proclaim intelligent design.